Welcome to Northwest Book Talk on 99.9 KXRW with your host, Patty Grasher. Stay tuned to connect with book lovers and book writers of the local area. On the show, you'll discover new books, take a look at older but great books, and tune in as Patty talks with Northwest authors, book coaches, educators, bookshops, and yes, even librarians. If books are your passion, stay tuned and connected with Northwest Book Talk.
Hi, and welcome to the very first show of Northwest Book Talk for KXRW Radio. We're off to a magical start with Shawna Reppert, a local award-winning, popular, and prolific author of fantasy and steampunk. Now, if you don't know what steampunk is, I didn't, stay tuned because we're heading into some mystical discoveries. Welcome, Shawna, to the program. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here.
So you had quite a writing journey just from looking at Amazon. I see it started in 2012, but did it start before that?
You know, it takes a long time to get from I want to be a writer, even if you're not starting at like 5 or 6, which is about the age where I decided I wanted to be a writer. But even, from the time that you first start writing what you think is going to be your first novel, it almost never is, to the point where you're published is many, many years for pretty much everyone. Depending on what else you have going on in your life, it can be more years than most.
So when did you make the switch to fantasy, or was that always your desire, was to go into fantasy?
Pretty much it was always my desire. I started wanting to be an author when I was a little kid. So when I was a little kid, I didn't really understand genres, and at the time I was reading mostly Nancy Drew, books about horses, the Black Stallion, that sort of thing. And so that's what I thought I was going to write because that's what I was reading. But by the time I hit high school, I was really committed to writing fantasy.
Shawna, when you wrote your first book that was actually published, what went into making that happen? I know there's like lots of years before that, but how did that push? I'm going to just go ahead and do it.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it and the actual doing it, there's a lot in between that. My very first novel was traditionally published. There's been a lot of changes in the publishing industry from the time I started. A fantasy romance, it was basically a male-male fantasy romance. I didn't set out to write a romance, but that's the genre that it ended up getting marketed into. And this is kind of the back and forth and the things to expect if you want to be a traditional author, which I don't recommend anymore. I wrote it, I shopped it around, I got as far as an acquisitions editor in Tor who was very interested, but ultimately they came back and said, we love your writing, we love your plot, we love almost everything about this book, but we have no idea how to market it. Again, that was many years ago. Male-male fantasy romance wasn't even really a genre at that time, or certainly not one that was recognized and done and sold by traditional publishing. So I shoved that in the drawer. I wrote a couple other novels. I was shopping them around, trying to get an agent, trying to get a publisher. And I was at a workshop trying to make this as quick as possible. And I overheard someone say, man, I wish, I wrote male-male fantasy romance because, that's like really hot right now in certain markets. And I'm like, I'd never even heard of it being a market. So I was like, really, where do I send it? Resend it out now that was a thing that was happening in traditional publishing. Send it out to a publisher that specialized in that. Picked up right away. That was my first traditional book.
How did you make that transition into solely Amazon publisher?
Carina Press was very much interested in seeing another romance from me, and they were rejecting my other stuff. And I knew that if I published a second fantasy romance on the back of my first fantasy romance with nothing in between, that was going to be my branding. I was going to be a fantasy romance author, which No offense, I actually enjoy reading it. It's well done, but not what I wanted to be doing with my life. So, in between trying to come up with something that they did want, I started independently publishing the Raven's Blood series. So that was my first series, and that was the first independently published series, that I did.
So how did you make that transition into a little sense of horror perhaps in it and a touch of romance, but there's just a lot more plot to your story? How did you make that transition?
Yes. So it's, first of all, just because genres are so specific, it's more what you would call dark fantasy than horror. And kind of is a little bit more my nature. Like I said, writing a fantasy romance was almost an accident because the romance was part of, as an author, you make your author's life or your character's life as difficult as possible. The romance became a difficulty, became how the book was marketed. But anyway, I kind of tend to be a little bit more of a dark soul. I like to have not necessarily a happy ever after ending in the sense that romance writers or romance readers expect it, but I like the ending to be hopeful.
Right. Okay, so how did you blend this fantasy and then like a historical aspect to the time, the Victorian times? How did you blend that and how much research went into making that happen?
A ton of research. I was, at the point I was starting to do the research for that, oh man, that was actually back before I even sold the first novel. And this is kind of how it works when you're trying to break in traditional. You have a ton of stuff floating around that you're trying to sell if you're smart, if you're wanting to do that, which I don't recommend. But I had heard about this thing called steampunk, and I was at cons and saw these cool costumes, and I was like, what's that all about? And went to a panel on what is steampunk. They were talking about the whole Victorian history, which I loved to begin with, and I just found intriguing. And one of the editors who was up there, who I knew through the fantasy world at the time, I was still trying to break into fantasy, said, that she's working on this anthology and she was having a lot of trouble getting professional quality submissions. And I thought, well, I could probably do that. And I had a little itty bitty snippet of an idea from a writing exercise I did for a part of a class. I pulled up that snippet. I had just sent off a novel length submission. I didn't put a whole lot into it. I got 3 days to this deadline, do or die, wrote the piece, sent it off. And I got a response back, and I was looking at it right away, and I'm like, well, that's real quick for a rejection, kind of insulted. And then I start reading it, and I realize, oh, wait a minute, this isn't a rejection. This is an acceptance. I just sold this piece to this anthology. And I decided, and I've been trying to break into fantasy for many years at that point, and I decided I really liked steampunk. So that little short story that I sold to the anthology became a prequel to the series I'm working on now. As far as werewolves, I love wolves. It's kind of my, spirit animal. People get hostile when Anglos use that term because they say it's stealing from the Native Americans, but there were many, many pre-Christian tribes, clans, organizations of all different colors of skin that had the concept of spirit animal. I'm a pagan of European descent. And so anyway, wolves are my thing. I used to own a wolf hybrid. I know a lot about wolves. I did more research into the tracking capabilities of wolves to write this novel. I read a ton of stuff about the Victorian era. The exciting thing about the Victorian era is that there's a lot of first source research that's available because at that point newspapers were common and there's in existence articles, letters to the editor, all sorts of things that gave you a real feel for the time. And so I did just a ton of time absorption research, learning about Victorian London, and then throwing in little tidbits into the research. And if I ran into something I didn't know, I Googled, I reached out. I have some go-to sources now for Victorian era research that I can get information from.
Now we got that background, almost like a world building that we've gone into.
Yeah.
What about plot? Because your books are excellently, intricately, powerfully plotted. So how did you get to that point?
Thank you so much. Learning about plot is almost its own language, and it's a thing that can be learned, and it's a thing if you want to be a writer, you have to learn. And everyone has their favorite way of doing. I prefer outlining. That everyone has their own way of shaping the story, whether you do an outline or not. My go-to source was Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, which talks about story structure in terms of Campbell's hero's journey. Before I kind of internalized that arc, I would actually start a story with a stack of index cards and Vogler's book, would read through the book, write down like story elements onto the index cards and put them in order, so that when I went to write the story, I had this outline based on the hero's journey all on these index cards, and it might have like 2 or 3 words on the card, or a sentence or 2, and then that would become that scene, and I would flip it over. So that's the bare bones of how I learned plot. And then, of course, you always are learning as an author, and done a lot of other research into story structure and how to build a good story, and tension and micro-tension and all of that.
So I noticed that you've gotten a lot of awards, like even your very first book got
Yeah.
awards. So what do you think made that happen, that you got these awards? Was that a complete surprise to you? Did you have to work to channel it? Those awards make an impact on your life.
Yeah, it really made an impact, especially on my debut novel, where, yes, I really have something here that, it's a kind of a validation, because I think every author, unless they're like an absolute narcissist, every author has kind of what they call imposter syndrome, which is kind of, who am I to be writing this book? So it was like, yes, not just my best friends and a few people out there in internet land like my book, but like it has serious weighty merit. That was incredibly validating. So that always helps. I mean, as an author, you don't want to put a whole lot of weight into awards, because only one person can win, or in some awards where there's a series of medals, only a handful of people will win. And that if you don't win the award, that doesn't mean that your book is not any good. But as someone who won the awards, it is incredibly validating. It does say that there are people who judge these sorts of things, who judge it worthy, and that's pretty exciting.
You're listening to Northwest Book Talk. I am your host, Patty Grasher, and I'm here today with Shawna Reppert, fantasy and steampunk author. When we come back, we're going to talk about how Shawna blends fantasy and historic elements into prize-winning books.
KXRW programming like this is made possible with the support of The Columbian, proud to be Southwest Washington's leading news source. Since 1920, the Campbell family has owned and operated the Columbian and ensured its award-winning news coverage. For the most thorough daily coverage of local news, national news, and local sports, both in print and online, and for subscription information, visit Columbian.com. That's COLUMBIAN.com.
KXRW Radio would like to help spread the word about food availability. Head to clarkcountyfoodbank.org and click on Find Food to access a map and printable list of pantry locations throughout the region where you can pick up or donate food. That's clarkcountyfoodbank.org.
Welcome back to Northwest Book Talk. I'm your host, Patty Grasher. I'm here today with Shawna Reppert, fantasy writer with more behind the scenes of what it takes to blend historic facts with spine-tingling fantasy. My next question is, you wrote first for The Raven's Blood, right?
Yeah.
Then you switched and started putting in werewolves. How did you keep these 2 different series going pretty much at the same time, right?
Yeah, I was basically alternating. Part of that was still spinning things into traditional publishing at the time. And you keep on throwing things out, trying to find what sticks. But yeah, it's like anything. I mean, it feels a little weird switching back and forth. As an author now, from what I know now that I didn't know then about marketing, I would recommend picking one series, writing it through, if you're going to go indie, and then develop your following. But be that as it went, it isn't what I did. It's just like anything when you, as a consumer of story, and if you're an author, you had better be a consumer of story, whether that be books, TV, movies. It's all story. As a consumer of story, you can go and watch Star Wars and be completely involved in that universe, and then the next week go and rewatch Lord of the Rings, and you're completely involved in that. So at first it felt weird, but then I just realized it's the same thing that you do as a reader. If you're one of those readers who is an obsessive fan who becomes completely involved in the world, you can become completely involved in multiple worlds. Every now and again, you have to stop and check yourself and say, okay, no, that phrasing is too modern and I'm in the Victorian era, or stop and check and say, wait a minute, my urban fantasy people are starting to sound like my Victorian characters. Need to pull that back. But it's just, you do it. It's like just like when you do it as a reader.
That's great. So now let's go into, you just started a whole new series. So tell us about that, how it got developed and what your plans are for that.
Well, that was kind of funny how it got developed. It was all a dream. Any writer who tells you that they dreamed the whole thing and just wrote it down, either it's not that good or they're kind of telling you a little bit of a white lie. But a scene of this started out from a dream. And when you write a lot, and as an author, you have to write a lot. You're writing every day. You start dreaming in story. It's like your dreams have plot arcs and character arcs. It's kind of sometimes a little scary. And I had this dream that was basically a scene from what felt like the tropiest urban fantasy that ever troped. Had the sassy hunter and the mouthy vampire, and and it was just a very brief dream. And I woke up and I thought, wow, if I really wanted to go 100% commercial, which is commercial in the sense of all I'm doing this for is the money. This is just what my late editor called the marketing bullseye, where it's just right in the center of everything. And it's what everyone expects in urban fantasy. And I was, the next day, coincidentally, I was in a webinar with Don Moss, who is the most amazing writing teacher in the world. If you have a chance, read all his books, go to his webinars, go to his seminars, everything. Anyway, I was someone I very much respect as a mentor. And I was telling him this, I don't even know how he got on the subject about this dream. And I said, if I really wanted to sell out, I could write this. And he said to me in a very serious voice, you can throw in all of the tropes and have it be as tropey as anything ever. And if you write it with conviction and you write it with integrity, it's still going to be a book that matters. And I kind of got a chill down my spine, and also it sounded a little bit like a challenge. And so I decided, okay, fine, I'm going to write this. And so I did.
So tell us a little bit about the plot that would make us say, oh, we got to have this book.
It's sort of like the classic enemies to, eventual lovers in this book. In the first book, it's kind of enemies to sort of reluctant friends, but it's written a lot deeper than that. So at the start of the series, or the start of the book, Constance Yeager, who is our hunter, who's our protagonist, is a hunter, which means she is responsible for taking out rogue vampires and rogue paranormals. At this point, vampires and paranormals and everything have just kind of come out of the closet because they figured out with all the doorbell cameras and the CCTV and internet and people sharing stories and comparing notes, there's eventually people are going to figure out that they really exist. They can't hide anymore. So they came out, and there was this big international legal conference with the United Nations and the signatory countries, basically stating that ultimately the result is that paranormals are citizens. They have certain rules that they have to follow. Obviously, killing is out. There's all sorts of rules around consent with getting blood from a live source and, turning someone in. Actually, it's hit a point where the bureaucracy that responsible werewolves, if they're going to go out on the town, they basically print and laminate a disclosure to read to people before they bite them. So hunters go back way into the dawn of time before pre-recorded history, and it's been this society that killed vampires and other problem paranormals secretly because no one knew that there were hunters, no one knew that there were vampires. It was all, under the covers. And now the Accords, they're still functioning. It's sort of a paralegal in the sense of just like paramilitary. There's acknowledged need for them because conventional, mundane law enforcement isn't in a position to deal with these people, but at the same time, they don't fit in our legal structure. So they're doing their thing, but now they have rules to follow, and they can't just kill every vampire they see. So they're relearning how to live in this, or Constance, as a hunter, is relearning how to do her job in this world where she can't kill every vampire that she sees, where she needs to have cause. And that means that some vampires kind of get away with a whole lot that they wouldn't have before, but she feels that she has enough proof to kill them.
So is this book your first book where the heroine is the main person, not a side character?
Yeah, it is the first book where I have a female protagonist. In the Raven's Blood series, it's almost primary and secondary protagonists, especially in the first book because there's literary reasons for that, where Cassandra is almost co-equal to Raven in the point of view, and it ultimately becomes Raven as protagonist. And it is weird as a female author that I tend to write predominantly male protagonists, but then I have a male friend who predominantly writes female protagonists, and he does a great job. If you didn't know that he was a man, you wouldn't know that it was a man writing a woman. So who knows? Maybe I'm getting in touch with my inner masculine spirit. Who knows? But yeah, it started out with Constance as a protagonist. It's the first long work that I've written first person, which I agonized over, but it wouldn't be written any other way. It was like Constance came into my subconscious as a fully formed character, and she was going to tell the story in first person, and there was no other way to do it. I mean, I couldn't take hold of the story. She had it and ran with it.
So that's very cool. So how can readers get a first free look at some of your writing?
Yes. So for the Raven's Blood series, there is a novella, Raven's Song, and that is I call it bait. There's another word for it that's more professional, but it's reader bait. So if they sign up for my newsletter at my website, which is www.shawna-reppert.com, as soon as they get on that website, this offer pops up. When they sign up for my newsletter, they will automatically get a copy of this novella. It's kind of Raven's Blood 1.5 because it falls in between the first and the second books chronologically. And it's just a fun little novella. It's written to totally stand alone, so you don't have to have read the series to enjoy it. So that's one way. Another way is if you stay with my newsletter, because of course you can sign up and then get your novella and then cancel right away. I don't think that that's bad karma. I won't think bad things about you or send bad energy in the world. But in my newsletter, I do periodically offer promos of, either free or discounted. Recommend using that particular device as well.
Well, I wanted to say thanks, Shawna, for sharing your story, your books. I really kind of wanted to go into how many awards and stuff that really, I think, really validate your writing. But I was just like knocked over because we first met at an event, and I read your book, and I'd never read a book really about werewolves before, and I'm not sure about this, and it was just fascinating. It's like I'm just hooked. Oh well, it's like it's all over now. So anyway, thanks, Shawna, for this interview, and thanks for being with the program.
Great, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Patty Grasher with Northwest Book Talk on 99.9 KXRW, serving the greater Vancouver area. Join us next time for another great interview with local authors and book lovers.